All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for being here again. We are going to get into our next conversation, which I have the great honor of introducing curator Allison Glenn from the Counterpublic 2023 Curatorial Ensemble. So, thank you, Allison. Artist Damon Davis, whose work is on view at City Park in the Brickline Greenway with the permanent installation Pillars of the Valley, and also a film commissioned and premiered on Friday evening. It is on view at 2626 Cherokee Street. Thank you, Damon. Artist Torkwase Dyson, who I've had the great privilege of working with throughout Counterpublic to realize her largest work to date, a piece called Bird and Lava for Scott Joplin. It is on view for the next 3 months at St. Louis Place Park. Please do experience it. It is a true stunner. And finally to David Adjaye, whose work will be realized in public view on site at the Griot Museum of Black History throughout Counterpublic and will open prior to our exhibition's close. So it's my job to get out of the way and let these people talk to each other because we're in for quite a treat. So thank you for being here, and thank you all.
Thank you, James. So we were told to, yes, actively grab the mics. Good morning. How is everybody? To start, I want to thank you all for being here. And I feel super honored to be in dialogue together. I think a great place for us to begin would be to just briefly explain your work for Counterpublic. And there's a few questions or provocations I have around that. And we'll start with you, Damon. So the question is, each of your works engages with the histories of the sites that you're working at. What is your relationship to those histories? And how do they manifest within the formal, conceptual, or material choices that you've made?
Well, I think so. From the start, the one piece, the permanent monument, Pillars of the Valley, it started about 4 to 5 years ago. I was working on it, so love the Counterpublic, but it wasn't in my purview, so to speak, when I started working on it, and so the elements of time were. I guess it wasn't like a commission. So the time and the way that I was thinking about it was specifically for the histories that were lost in Mill Creek. The people that were there, it was a Black community, and I was just thinking about the fact that they were displaced, and so it was a purposeful erasure of history or covering up. So what I was trying to do was trying to come up with a way to in space, in physical space. I guess make something that would honor, vindicate, validate those stories, and bring back excavate is the best way I could put it. Like almost like archaeologists, uncover histories that were purposely covered. So I think that at least that was my goal with Pillars of the Valley.
And how did you realize that with material choices?
For one thing, the initial idea was supposed to be using actual physical soil from where we sat to do it, but it was I had a whole lot of dreams, and the architects let me know that that might not work, bro. So I had to figure out different ways to get that idea across. So what we ended up doing was choosing limestone, which is also a rock that's indigenous to St. Louis, and specifically that part of St. Louis. So that is what the capstone is. But initially, I had a lot of ideas that didn't exactly work. So that's specific around the material. It's literally the ground itself. So again, back to excavating the ideas.
That's a really nice connection. I actually am going to ask David to speak to this idea of excavation and limestone and maybe pushing beyond it or ideas you had and how it's shifted with your work.
Sure. No, it's again the same sort of encounter. Mine was about a kind of really thinking about the Griot as a site and working with the history that's sort of been consolidated in that building and thinking about the connections of that history to its deep past and also its potential future. So mine is a kind of an imagining of the space around the griot no longer just being a sort of front and back, but a sort of a landscape that starts to emanate a relationship with people and the context, and one that really uses the cylindrical forms as a way to remember the sort of first sort of geometries of architecture on the continent of Black people. And so it's a kind of fragment that's trying to kind of play with that. So in a way, mine's kind of looking at sort of deep history, deep time, and then sort of moving forward. But again, I'm an architect in my day job, and yes, the soil issue, because what you realize about St. Louis is that it's what it was and what it is now are very different, and so there are many geologies. And so in what we were trying to do, it started off as just trying to kind of literally bring the earth up, but then transformed into really understanding the hybrid nature of the soil and the hybrid nature of the landscape. So the idea of the soil of the bricks that were made, with sort of iron-rich brick, sort of recycling, upcycling those, crushing those, and restarting, finding where soil deposits are in the region and bringing those, because the soil is the soil. Our geographic dimension is nothing to do with what the Earth's sort of ability to kind of make soil. So understanding the soil from the region, and then also the limestone. So it's a kind of composite is what we've managed to kind of get to achieve these cylindrical systems. So it's a kind of translation, but also a very specific relationship to the place. Yeah.
And Torkwase, I'd say materially, the way that resonates with your work is through the sonic intervention that your sculpture makes, and I'd love for you to speak to that.
Sure. My challenge was really trying to figure out syncopation in the ways in which Scott Joplin was a genius at that. So the research was really in relationship to an inventor, a technology that he used called the piano. And the idea of syncopation is also a form that Black people tend to exist in pretty organically. So that was running simultaneously. My research with Scott Joplin and his work sort of ran parallel to the sort of poetic work that I was doing with painting and drawing. So the challenge was to create an amalgamation of the two. And so, yeah, sound became material and space became material. So what came out of that, I think, are geometries that are really necessary for throughways and improvisations and pathways to really exhaust the possibility of syncopation.
And I think intervention probably wasn't the right way to describe your work. It's more of engagement. And I think I'd love to also speak a bit about the body, right? When I walked into your sculpture, I had the luxury of being one of two people in there. And at every turn, my body was engaging with form and sound in different ways. How should someone be navigating that space? Or what are you thinking about with someone navigating that space, and what is the intention with the body?
So one thing about considering how one creates a form and imagining Scott Joplin creating Ragtime Leaf, I really sort of sunk into this idea of solitude. And as a painter, I spend most of my time in solitude. So the quadrilateral spatial sound installation was really based on individuals sort of feeling the bass, right? Feeling the kind of drawing that I was doing in the space. So it was a matter of how do you create a system that is discursive and visceral and allow a sort of a physical syncopation, but also to produce a sort of organic syncopation through desire. Like, I want people to sort of walk behind the piano walls. I want them to desire to sit in the center, and I wanted the way the sound moves through the space to make people really curious about how I might exist there or there or there. So that was the way I think about people, really experiencing it with groups of people and really individuals. Like, let's be in solitude, and then let's be in the space of sociality and both be generative experiences.
I felt that. And the center stools are also movable.
Right. So one of the things about listening and thinking through Scott Joplin is the idea of how do you achieve that kind of sound condition. And Keith, you can speak to this as well. Like, how do you hear someone's hand like pound on a piano, and then the other hand doing something paradoxical, and I think I learned a lot from Keith and Mendi, having things simultaneously in multiple places at the same time. But those stools are a way to pick up something and move something somewhere else, and just move it an inch or move it across. And the idea of modularity is also, modularity, syncopation, improvisation have to exist to really produce a discursive condition or a dialectical condition. So, how do you make something that's once a container about and of and for Black people who have conditions of enclosures that they still need to liberate inside of, right? So those things need to operate for that, in that potential, right? They just happen to be boxes, but they could be ball, they could be whatever.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that question, and I'd love for both David and Damon to answer as it relates to the work that you're working on here.
Could you ask the question one more time?
Absolutely. Well, so Torkwase, the question that you asked was, how as it relates to Black people and thinking about space and time and environment. That's how I understood it, but please elaborate if there is something that perhaps I've missed.
No, not at all. I think that one of the things about why we're all here to think about something that you are contributing to sort of hyper-capitalist condition is the idea of the fixed and this idea of dispossession and this idea of erasure, both and fixed ontologies. And if David's proposition is that these geometries are from an ancient continental discursive diverse space, and then we live in a racial capital that claims these geometries as somehow autonomous, that the refusal of that must be one that operates on different registers, right? So
Absolutely.
the question is, my question continues to be, how do you produce a condition that refuses that on multiple levels? How do you push a condition to say, no, I'm righteous, that's it, that's where I belong, and move on about your business,
Well, I think you said it. I mean, I think it's about, I wake up every morning, and Black people, we wake up in America. We didn't, a lot of us didn't have a choice to be here. And I think a lot of it is about survival and resilience, and not in the way, now that's supposed to be cool to say, you know what I'm saying? And I don't think that we should praise being punished and being able to take a whole lot of punishment. But I do know that my family for generations has survived, and it's because, and the only reason I'm up here sitting in front of y'all talking to all these people is because of generations and generations of sacrifice have culminated in me. So I understand that, and I think that when you talk about rhythm and you talk about mute, like that's us doing that, bobbing and weaving and surviving. And so when I was thinking about my piece, I really wanted to remember that somebody was here and somebody was moved out of here, and then making sure that nobody ever forgets that history of those people, right? So the best way to do that was to make something as big as possible and something that towered over people, to make sure that they have to confront the histories that's been here. So, and hopefully people that haven't even been born yet, little Black kids will walk up to that thing, and by knowing that people were here and they survived, so that means that those people created me, so I will survive. I think that's a part of that waking up righteous. I think that's the only way to do it. And yeah, I think that that's something not totally unique to Black people in America, but we very much experienced in how to survive in that sort of
That's
onslaught.
belonging, right?
Yeah.
You want to make sure belonging continues.
Yeah, exactly.
And this conversation is like the sort of, you just lit a fuse to Kwasi. It's beautiful to watch the action striking. But I think that this whole question of how do Black bodies exist in space in the world is the fundamental question that we're all wrestling with after colonization and enslavement, and then a sort of integration. And what is integration? And then also what is the luxury of just production, right? What is the luxury of just being who we are, rather than going through the lens of other things that we've been forced to accommodate? And so for me, I'm sort of, in my work, I'm very interested in imagining always that freedom, right? So how do you just perpetually create a resistance by imagining freedom? And that's the resistance. The resistance is to not, for me anyway, I mean, I think there are many paths, but for me is to not consolidate that trauma into the process of expression, but to always seek a way in which one can try to find oneself, and to have a luxury of being able to then speak to oneself in the act of creating. Because ultimately, that's the most powerful thing that we can do, is to just contribute to the fact that we're human beings on this planet, and we have, as human beings, the right to express ourselves, right? So then, for me then also, the question of our ancestral history is not just historical. It's almost like a sort of imperative of the DNA to understand how, because essentially to be human is to be a kind of a reborn body through the cell regeneration, right? So we are reborn so many times, so we are basically encoded histories. So if we're encoded histories, we're not just about our individuality, we're about the sum of the experience of being human beings in the world. So surely there has to be some merit in history beyond history. It is a kind of fundamental DNA of who we are. So for me, you can collapse it, but you collapse it consciously. So for me, it's a place where one really has to start and then reconfigure. So that's how I kind of answer that question. Yeah.
It's brilliant. The three of you are just, it's remarkable to think of the different ways that we talk about abolition, freedom, collapsing, expanding, imagining. During the process with the curatorial ensemble, we talked a lot about the fact that we live within this space of the colonial imaginary. That's currently what we either decide to reside within or make a decision to imagine another way. And so perhaps with that intention, do you want to speak to the process of imagining that your work allows or creates?
Should we go this way? I just finished, so I feel like some other sound should happen.
I think that's a good question, and I'm gonna answer it through the idea of process, right? So how do I, as an individual, work myself to silence, right? How do I, in the studio, create a condition where I am my absolute true self, right? And in that true self, make work that invents new pathways to my true self, right? So that assumes, and I have this practice called way over there inside me. So that assumes that myself is spacious. So my job right now, my practice, is to really explore the spaciousness of my true self, and then activate that to I'll say, exhaust the possibilities of the things that I know in that form, right? So it takes drawing and painting and writing, all with the activity of exhausting the possibility of the things my mind will allow. And then laying that out, right, and doing it over and over and over again. And I think that that takes deep solitude. And then when it's presented to a public or my partner or my friends, it then gets this sort of vibration happening. And then it's its own self. And then when people respond to me with it, then I know if I really have, asked the good question about who I am. And because that belonging is so deep and collective, but not universal, it really brings me pure, euphoric joy when people who have no idea what is going on in that solitude space can feel something that takes them to a future, right? So that's that string of becoming, belonging, ongoing, of Blackness that I just have the deepest pleasure of existing in. It's like that. So if that makes sense, that future, present.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Shall I go or do you want to go?
I mean, I can go. I really like that you're saying finding your true self, because I think I tessellate between this idea of yourself is two things. It's how the world greets you when you're born, like the myths that you're born into, man, woman, black, white, all of those things. And then as you get old, as you start to become self-aware, then you start to see, do you fit into these boxes? So most of your life is either fitting into those boxes or actively trying to break out of them, right? And so much of the time when we sit up here as black, we are black artists, and that's not something that people usually choose. It's just that's what you given when you step in front of people, and we have to speak for, at least in my life, if I'm the only black person in the room and the word black happens, everybody looks at me, right? And so when I'm in my studio and I'm trying to tapping into my truest self, I try to put all those things away, but I also know that I come from just a history of people, and the family that I come from, all of those things make up who I am. The environmental attributes, as well as what I got going on inside of me. So I agree with the idea, like rigor, and like it's a workout every possible way I can get out an idea. And I think that as an artist, when we working through that, I have a hard time making it just, this is my own personal expression. I'm always thinking about, I'm having an active conversation with everyone else. And so I try to make things, or the things that I do present, I'm just ready for it to be in the conversation of a community aspect and community, I guess, activism is not the word, but just I know that I'm in conversation with people like me. So I like what you said about, or what I heard was, we make things that are original, but they are familiar to those that are like us because of the familiarity that we have as black people and of the diaspora. There's a universal, at some point, there's a universal understanding of what it means to be black. But even though we are all individuals and there's no one way to experience that life, there's a familiar feeling that we get if you can really tap in, and that's the future that we building towards. At least that's what I'm trying to build towards. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting to sort of have to wrestle with. I mean, it's funny. I was always scared to get to that point of joy that you speak about at the beginning, and for me, architecture was a way to avoid that. Yeah. So that was kind of really fascinating. I mean, to avoid that, because to somehow give pleasure to yourself was seen to be completely the most decadent thing that I could do, and somehow it felt as though it was profligate or Catholic, maybe. So it took me a long while to finally let go of that. And in a way, I think that my sort of early work really was about really this kind of concern with trying to find ways in which a kind of parallel state could occur. So in a way, can you create sort of a symbiosis that has its own identity that refuses assimilation, but has its own identity, but understands the construction of the world that you're in, right? So it was kind of like a struggle with, the mutations of that. But I think that it's sort of, as I've sort of grown a little bit older, I sort of have become just deeply in awe of the archive of Black people, right? So it's just, and the idea, the responsibility, but not in any heavy way, but there's just the incredible pleasure, and that's where the pleasures now come in, of being able to contribute to the archive of Black people has just been just like euphoric. So for me, the search for like, what is that other move now in this archive? It's just become so pleasurable that it's, for me, I'm always like, almost like laughing in the studio when we kind of work through something and it sort of unfolds to a place where you say, oh my God, that is now telling me something. For me, that's what I was always looking for. Is when the work gets to the place where it starts to show you something that you didn't even know, even though it's coming through your body, right? And then that's when you know that it's like, okay, let's try and manifest that in the world.
I think that
Your microphone, Torkwase, sorry.
when I watch that phenomenon of having a person make something and then learn from that thing, I think the first time I saw that and I knew kind of what it was Cecil Taylor, right? So he's doing Cecil Taylor, and I'm watching him just on YouTube learn from that doing in real time, and then applying it seconds later to the next thing. And so that sort of zone of mindfulness and brainness is something that I think I know that I can achieve with deep study of something, right? So, or when I think about Mahalia and singing back to herself, or even watching, like looking at a Mary Lovelace O'Neill painting, it's like, fuck, So, yeah, that is that kind of freedom and ancestorship and liveness that I think that like I'm interested in. And I'm not even sure what is happening with architecture in my work right now, but I know it is insane. I'm not sure how someone chooses to spend their life dedicated to this thing. But my completely, painting is a super safe zone. You know what I mean? It's a super safe zone. So to cross over to even think about bodies occupying a space, I think in its, talking about DNA, in its construction of a thing, you're indelibly tied to what humans need,
But you jumped into it so seamlessly. I think this. No, it's amazing to. What I really enjoyed about the work, if I can just jump off,
Please,
is the way in which you were able to use narratives that are to do with mathematics and space into which is the kind of foundation of form making, but to translate that into a form which is at once recognizable and completely disorientating. Yeah. So there was a kind of deep pleasure in being able to sort of recognize it, but also not know it. And that sort of resonance was really, it was very magical. Yeah.
Thank you, Sir David Adjaye. What do you say to that?
do you want to engage with the idea of architecture and the body?
Yeah, I think it's rough too. But what I do think that we all got in common, no matter what field, because I don't really designate my practice to one thing, but I think of it as storytelling, and in culture building, and like you were saying, adding to the rich history of what Blackness is and what Black creativity is. So I think in that regard, we are architects, because it's like we're cultural architects. We're consciously making things to add to the landscape of the spiritual aspect of being Black, or the spiritual aspect of human existence. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I like to, when I'm thinking about architecture, because the numbers and the math, that's why I learned how to draw. You know what I'm saying? It was not my favorite thing to do. You know what I'm saying? So I have much more respect now after this last project for what it takes to make something and to make sure it stays standing. Yes, I have a lot more respect for that now. But what I did learn is that I've been doing that my entire life with the things that I've been creating. I just wasn't accessing that skill set in that way. I didn't think about it as that same skill set. So that's what I'm taking from architecture, that you take the materials you have around you and build something that shelters you and shelters others, whether it's emotionally, mentally, physically, like that, you're building shelter. So that's what I think. Yeah, I think that's what I like to take from my small foyer into architecture, and so forth.
Just to add a little bit to that, because you just entered architecture, so I have to add a little bit into that. In a way, you know, there is a difference between construction and architecture, and that architecture is that moment past construction where the intention or the idea is the guiding principle of construction. It's the other way around. So, and the reason why a temple is architecture is because it's all about the idea. It's nothing to do with practicality. I mean, there's some practical things you do in it, but it's completely a bizarre idea. So I think, you know, to always gauge when you're entering architecture is when you're transforming ideas into form. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about sculpture in the round? And not
Thank you for that question, Torkwase. Yes.
My sculpture?
Sculpture with a capital S.
It's a baby.
No, really, thinking about your space in making objects in the round, in this way in which it doesn't have a condition of containment necessarily, or a form that thinks about enclosure and a kind of all-overness, but you know, sculpture that is a condition of really using or having no cap, no end point, no beginning, but is something in the round.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so hard if you really focus on it. I mean, it's very hard. It's very easy to gesturally do it, but it's so hard to move to the ovoid in the form, because the whole world that we inhabit is constructed. It wasn't before, but it's now constructed using rectangles. So it's so hard to move there, unless if you just want to be contrarian, but to move there with intentionality and to then see that as a space that really starts to operate a completely different sort of system. And I'm sort of, for me, sculpture is a great sort of immersion into really starting to fully be conscious about what the ramifications of those things are. So in a way, for me, the sculpture that I made at the social show and its second variation, which is really just this unfolding, really is trying to put myself outside and inside of this idea of this ovoid, and to try not just to be assumptive about it at all. And so how do you know, the problem with the ovoid is that it's also the most familiar form to our bodies, right? So there's a lot of overreading. So how do you slow down that overreading, and how do you just take time to really understand the kind of power of it? And so in a way for me, slicing it was a kind of very violent act, but one that was necessary for me to start to kind of unfold it, you know, to just, I couldn't quite make it yet. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe.
It seemed like interesting, this idea of the extrusion of form, right? When things sort of.
Torkwase, I'm so sorry to interrupt,
Sorry.
but
I apologize. Thinking of geometry as these extrusions that operate across space, and the idea of symbiosis, right? And when I think about that in a contemporary sculptural form, I oftentimes think about the politics, of course, of environmental justice, environmental liberation, and acts of, like, how do we understand the world now in a condition of desensitizing sensoria? Like, how do you push towards sensoria? And this sort of bifurcation and extrusion of these forms, in my mind, the way that the eye moves, right, and the cones in the way the cones in my brain follow light, I'm hopping, right? I'm moving right across it. So yeah, in my imagination, this sort of movement happens in that sculptural proposition.
Sculptor.
And I think in that sense of time, David, I think you have to catch a flight.
I unfortunately have to catch a plane, so sorry. But
We're going to continue
so
the
love this.
conversation.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So there's some commonalities within the dialogue that we just had that are cyclical, that are really anchored to histories that are embedded in Blackness, broadly, expansively, call and response, syncopation, circularity. And I really appreciated early on, Torkwase, when you were talking about learning from Keith, because Mendi and Keith also weren't supposed to be here today. Their flight was canceled, but what I really enjoyed about the St. Louis Place relationship to your works in that space is that there is this kind of call and response. And I wonder if I can ask you all to talk about that in dialogue, and also situate it within the deep community work you've been doing for 4 years with your sculpture. Because we're talking about community engagement on very different registers in St. Louis.
Can we bring up another chair?
There's a chair right there, yeah.
But there's 2 of them.
Yes, oh no, there's an extra chair right there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So,
Is that okay?
Come on down. This was my plan.
And if you all, I can pass the mic down.
I sure will. Oh, I see what's happening. Got it. I got it. That's right.
All right.
Well,
Hello.
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 I've known. We've known each other a very long time.
A very long time, yes. So it's beautiful to be here with all of your projects and to be in conversation with Allison. This has been great. And it's been wonderful for us working in the St. Louis Place community, and not only getting to know the site and the people who live in the community, but also the artists across St. Louis. And so for us, I mean, we really just tried to make our dialogue with the community and with the artists specifically audible. And so that's really what our project is called, Slow Drag. And so, yeah, we tried to make it audible and kind of reinscribe those relationships through sound. Yeah. Is that it?
That's
Is that
it.
accurate?
That's
okay.
it.
And I think, oh, Torkwase, please. No.
So when I the first time I understood what was happening with Mendi and Keith and the way they thought about space and sound, I don't know, it was in when was that?
When
2001?
yeah, 2001, yeah.
Oh, 2001. And the way in which they were thinking about space and sound and storytelling and communication, and I had never, like, physically and even in my imagination seen two people create such an experience for multiple people, right? So when I heard that Keith and Mendi were going to do something for Counterpublic, I knew that it was going to be spatial. People were going to move their bodies. There was going to be some kind of inventive sound, sonic, cinematic condition happening. And so yesterday, because their piece was sort of this mobile, I don't even know what to really call it. Because it wasn't a parade. I thought it was kind of even beyond a procession, right? Because when I think about the cars, and I'm from Chicago, maybe it's that, it was slow drag. It was that kind of thing where I was like, wow, what did I say yesterday? The troops have arrived.
That's what you said.
And I
right? The formulation of the vehicles, the people in the vehicles, their faces, their intention, their flags, their order. It was such a powerful condition to experience, one after another, like moving down this street. And I just felt a presence. And I felt like there was identity there, like a really strong sense of identity. And I thought it was a radical way to produce and display identity in this moment, right? So I just felt safe, and I felt protected. It's like one of those things when people, show up, in order. It was fantastic.
Pull up in motorcade. Yeah.
And I think, Damon, with regard to your work and how the sculptures are going to be developing over time, right? There is also this sense of continuity, time, procession, deep engagement with community. So I'd love, like, my intention here, this was not meant to happen, is really to have this dialogue about deep engagement with community and what that looks like in what ways, and how your work is really pointing to that, and how your work is, all of your work is pointing to that.
Yeah. And specifically with this project, I've learned to compartmentalize a lot of things. One, from being Black, you got to do that to mentally survive. But as far as my practice, like this project, I heard about something that happened in a place that I was from that I didn't know about, and I want to make sure no Black kid ever grew up like that again. Not knowing that there was a community here that existed, and they would never be forgotten again, right? And so that ain't really me going through my own internal struggles, because I didn't live there. I didn't make this for me, I made it for my folks and for my people that's from here. And so that was my main intention, to have a conversation with those ancestors and the descendants that come later. And so while doing that, I had a lot of help from Great Rivers Greenway, but I got to meet these elders that were children that lived there. And just by listening to them, one, again, familiarity. It was super familiar, They sound like my aunts and my uncles, the people that raised me. And I was just trying to pay attention and soak up as much as possible. And one specific thing that I wanted to do was make sure their words were cut into this stone, so that it would never go away. And when you see the inscriptions inside of the pillars, those are actual quotes from people. And I want to make sure too that it wasn't all good shit and it wasn't all bad things. And it was a tapestry of what it was like to live there, because we usually, again, there's stereotypes and there's ideas about what it is to be Black that's always portrayed, and then we get caught up in trying not to do that and make sure that we don't ever show the negative. But that was not my goal. My goal is to show the whole thing, the complexity of Black life, and specifically the complexity of Black life in that specific neighborhood. So it's been one of the most fulfilling projects I've ever done. Is talking to these people and gathering these histories, and Yeah, and again, it's an ongoing thing. And in physical space, when we talk about procession, it's a literal procession down the street. Like we start with one capstone and we keep making these until it ends at Harris Stowe. You know what I'm saying? So it's a physical walk down the street that the pieces do, and since it's a mile long, it's not even close to what this neighborhood was, but at least it's a start, and it's an altar to these people and these histories and the spiritual energy that still exists here. So that was my focus, to make sure that we made an altar that didn't move for these people, and it's also an idea that if we can do that for them, then there's a lot of other histories that's been forgotten, not just Black people, the natives. It's a whole lot of people that's been taken from for this country to exist. And so it's about time for those histories to be acknowledged, because that's what makes this place what it is. Yeah.
I've been listening, and you know, the things that you said, and also David, who's not here, have been reminding me of a question that I have about my own work, and just hearing you all talk about it. You know, it's just, you know, what does it mean to be? You know, I've come to think about our work as being stewards of the culture, right? But stewards, I think in the past, I thought of that as someone who, all of the words I'm going to say, I have new understandings of, right? So steward is a word I have a new understanding of. I was going to say remembers the culture, or I was going to say just remembers the culture, or just keeps things the same. But realizing as I mature in my practice and age in my life, that those things are very active and creative acts. You know, like you were talking about keeping these words of the people, but like nobody is thinking about that like you are, right? And it takes your creativity to even keep something, you know, going. Torkwase, sitting in your piece yesterday, I remember being in your studio your first year at Yale and looking at your landscape paintings. And I was like, that's what she was talking about. That's how it's supposed to be looking at the sky. She was saying that in 2001, but I wasn't inside it. You know what I mean? Like, it took this long for her to make the thing that I could get inside so I could see the sky in that way, you know? And like, the sky has been there, right? You know, your perspective on some of the things you want us to think about looking at and being in dialogue with other artists, you know, that's been there. But it takes your creativity and lots of support and lots of time and lots of people to like see you for us to have that view on what we're supposed to be in dialogue or remember even, you know. And that, you know, that's been so moving to me to see with my dear friend for many years and from somebody I'm just meeting, you know, just to realize this thing that we're all a part of. And through that, through all of us, that remembering takes each of us, and it takes an active, you know, kind of creativity to produce.
Can I add one thing to that, what I heard? Because I just said, you know, I'm about to contradict myself, okay? So I just said I compartmentalize, and I do, right? But there's no way not for your personal fingerprint to come across on things. Whether you do it like, though those are their quotes, I'm picking parts of things. I'm curating, I'm directing. And so even in that, but I think David said something about just genetic memory, and I did. And so like every time somebody touches something, right, you've added to this huge being, like this living organism that is the spirit of blackness or whatever, or even on a broader note, the spirit of what it is to be a human being. And so I think that even though we compartmentalizing things, or we're stewards, or we're being charged to be scribes for the time period that we are in, because that's what artists do. We kind of, when you look back, the only reason we know about a lot of these fallen empires is because the art that was left behind. It's the statues and the buildings and stuff like that was cut into it. Each artist is also with their personal signature adding, leaving their DNA on it too. Even if they just writing down an autobiographer or whatever, like you still leaving your personal way of looking at it. And so I think that it's always a community conversation, no matter what's going on, no matter how, individualistic you want to make being an artist, it's still a community conversation.
It's a community conversation, but I was also struck by, you were talking about your interest in materials, and I think how that changed over time as you learn things and as you experimented with different things. And Torkwase talked about, excuse me, I've got gum, the same sort of thing, right? And so, yes, you're like in dialogue with the community, you're sort of going into yourself, and you're having this kind of dialogue with the material, right? And all those things shift over like 5 years, right? So that's a lot of time for like development, and that gets recorded also in the piece, right? Yeah.
I think this idea of community conversation is a really great moment to open up to questions from the audience. Okay, I see a question up there. I think we're going to bring a mic to you.
I can speak off.
Okay.
So this question is for Damon. I want you to speak to how you use simplicity in your art to say something profound and provocative.
Right on. What's up, Laney? How you doing, brother? I think that the hardest thing to do is to make things simple. You know what I mean? Especially when I looked up when I was a younger artist, I used to think that, the bigger the words in the rap, the smarter I looked. It was really a big exercise in ego a lot of times. And even in settings like this, I feel, and with white walls, it's very sterilized. It speaks to who it's talking to, and it's not talking to common people a lot of times. These spaces are very intimidating to working class people, black people. That at least the place that I grew up at, I did not feel like this was something for me. I didn't think before, and it took a lot of personal drive for me to believe that I could be a fine artist, because I didn't see any examples of that, right? And so a lot of times the art that really resonated with me, and the stuff that was available to me was TV, cartoons, stuff like that, but also like religious stories, mythology, right? And the things that seem childish. That I really like the idea of parables, simple stories that could be interpreted in many different ways. And so I try to apply that idea to whatever I'm doing so that it's accessible to as many people as possible, because I started to learn that if the simpler it is, the more people can understand, whether they speak the language, whether they come from the same place, whatever. If the more people you can get through to, is kind of the goal, especially if I'm in conversation with other people. Now, when I'm doing stuff for myself, I still think that the more true I am to myself, the more I can distill myself down to the most basic elements, then that the more micro you get, the more macro the story is, because the more in tune you are to who you are and the thing that you're trying to say, somebody will find something in it that they resonate with. So I try to keep my stuff as simple as possible for me, so that I can understand it, and so that I know what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying? And if I can understand it, then I think I think somebody along the way will find something in it. And so that's the stuff that I'm most proud of, and that's the stuff that I try to make when I'm trying to be in conversation with community.
Hi.
Thanks, all of you, for your words. I was going to actually ask this to the curatorial group before, but I think it actually applies really well to this group too. The balance between permanence and temporariness, and permanence sometimes can be something that's used to push against counterpublics and some communities that have been marginalized, but sometimes permanence is something to sort of establish an infrastructure that can be sustainable to support communities. And on the other side, like temporariness can be something that can be sensitive to the problematics of things being permanent. But on the other hand, a small gesture can potentially have a relationship to sustainability that's different than permanence. So my question is, how have each of you thought about that tension in relationship to the communities that you direct in your projects?
Mendi and Keith, do you want to start with that? And we'll just go down.
I've been thinking about this a lot. This is what I'll say. This is what I'll say about what I think. Some of it I will not say. Some of it I will say. What I will say, what I will say is that, one of the things that, we've been really investigating is the way that the ephemeral elements of our work, which include sound, but are not contained by, I don't know if anything is just contained in sound, but that are not limited to the sonic elements. We're thinking about the ways that those elements are part of our inheritance, what it means to direct attention to those elements, and what it takes to give space to those elements. I will also say that recently, for me personally, I've been thinking about just what it is to be alive, and knowing that those who have transitioned out of this plane of existence are not gone. It's really important that we refine our sensibilities for those things that are not material. And so that is what I'm meditating on right now.
I think, I'll echo a lot of what Mendi said, and we think a lot of our work as artists is to invite the public to question what we think of as permanent and impermanent. A lot of our work is about using invisible things to point at other invisible things and to make you sort of notice their presence around you. So that's it.
I'm interested in the idea of world building with the material engineering and the science of objects that are meant to fail and meant to continue. So there needs to be, in the tradition of, I think, East African nomadic traditions of world building, into the plan of ongoingness. There's materials that we understand that will fail, and there were materials that we understand that will sort of be in use for a long period of time. So this idea of the ephemeral, temporary, ongoing, or long-term has to have some kind of new relationship with world building in the tradition of both, I think, the tradition of nomadic people, the tradition of a kind of a pagan ritual of being, in the tradition of indigenous ways. That's what I think. And I think that the radical move of ongoingness is to really figure out how to manifest that right now. No, like, oh, we need to figure things. No, we understand what it is. It's just the people that have invented and lived this way have been dispossessed and have been erased, right? So what is the job of this question of art and ongoingness or in community and ongoingness. It doesn't make sense to think about, to me, to think really rigidly around what does it mean to continue a racial capital condition that works with dispossession and infrastructure that's toxic, right? So, I mean, I understand the question, but I also understand the answer is in a history that capital continues to erase. So in my mind, that's the work. That is the absolute sort of work, is really decolonizing what capital and racial capital and global capital has done, because people are still doing it, right? People are still living this way, and we are connected in networks that are both ephemeral and both kind of permanent. And also, Amir Baraka talks about sometimes you don't say it out loud, right? Sometimes you just don't say it out loud. So I'm interested in that way, you know, of being, because I am, by my spirit, my Obatala head is very nomadic. You know, there is no sense of landing. It's very sort of movement oriented. Like my friend calls me a squirrel. So if you can imagine how it is a squirrel activating, you know. So it needs to be room for all of us. And I think that, you know, indigenous and African practice and, you know, paganistic, but we have that.
Agreed. I think in my work, permanence, impermanence, I think I am trying to solve a problem. And so I use whatever tool is at my disposal at that point. So that's what I'm thinking about. What is the story of the problem that I'm trying to alleviate? And then specifically with Pillars of the Valley, it was about people that didn't get to permanently do what they wanted to do. So their time did end in a place without their choice. So to counteract that, I went in the opposite direction to make something as permanent as I could possibly make it. Stone, like cutting stone pillars in the street that wouldn't move, that at least outlast me in my lifetime. You know what I'm saying? So, but depending upon what situation it is, like, but we all understand that none of this, the sun gonna burn out. You know, I don't want to get too depressing, but nothing is forever. Nothing lasts forever, right? Right. So, and I think that one of the trappings of Western ideology and capitalism is trying to the great men that live forever and cut them into the side of mountains, and none of that ideology has proven toxic and is destroying us, right? So that's not the idea that I was trying to convey with my monument, but I did want to butt back at that idea but we don't never get to be permanent, right? We get herded around while these other people get to just take whatever they want. So for one moment, we take up as much space as possible, like in the center of the city that these people helped build. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like they help build this great thing, and then they get swept under the rug. So I just want to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. And so that's why I was trying to make my thing as permanent as possible. But that was the goal. That was the thing I was addressing. So depending upon whatever the next problem to solve, maybe it's about breaking up the idea of permanence. And so then I get as transient as I possibly can. So it depends on what the objective is for me.
Can I say something to that? What's so great about that condition of choice and being able to choose permanency and impermanency? It's another African practice. So tribes their function was to respond to the land and move other people who were long-termers, right? So you have people who were built in this nomadic tradition, and then that would help other people who wanted to get the condition of permanency, right? So that's the sort of discursive condition of being alive. And how do we do that with the technology and the ways of being and what we know and what we've created and the condition of extraction, right? So I really am concerned about this idea of ongoing extraction and dispossession as it pertains to choice, because I think that these moments of permanency can allow people to exhaust the possibilities of their humanness, right? And when that is disrupted without their will and without their, that is that's the way in which you perpetuate insanity, right? Because chaos can perpetuate that kind of insanity.
And I think that's the terrorism that Black people have been under since the beginning. You don't have any control. They could come in at any time. They moving you around.
Hortense Spillers.
Yeah.
What is love? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I see another question up there.
Hello, I have a question regarding, there was a conversation earlier on architecture and permanence and capitalism, and then you just mentioned like the nomad and like how there are kind of different elements and different flows in the world now and in the past and like where you place yourself. I'm really curious about the current times we're in and the current situation we're in where not everyone and not all communities have the ability to be nomads. And there are some spaces that are being attacked, that the permanence is trying to be uprooted and extracted. And so I'm curious of how you guys find those spaces to exist within where we are in a more sterile space, or we're in cities that there are more safer for people to put permanence and to like recognize history. I'm just curious like what your thoughts are now in the current times of when that's kind of being attacked and uprooted in certain spaces of community.
Well, let me...
Sorry, what was the end of that?
How that is being attacked. This idea of permanence and rootedness is being continuously attacked. And I want to draw on what the brother was just talking about and what Hortense Spillers continues to, this permanency and impermanency and this idea of vulnerability and community vulnerability is really attached to, and I hate to bring it up again, capital. Like how, in the history of what I'm talking about is in a kind of history based on extraction, exploitation, distribution, and before distribution, I'll say storage and distribution. So this ways in which we get to decide where our homesteads are, or where our community gardens are, or where our stores are, where our barter conditions are, where our schools are, where our prayer spaces are. All of that strength is in sociality, without a doubt. From sociality becomes education, it becomes sharing, it becomes skill sharing, and becomes mindfulness to exhaust those possibilities. What I'll say racial slavery and racial capitalism does, it insists that these systems create perpetual conditions of chaos. And that is in relationship to capital, whether you're talking about a community that is dispossessed because of a highway that's coming in, eminent domain, whether that's a hospital that's defunded because of the rise in pharmaceuticals. So the network of dispossession and displacement is so seated in this country because of genocide. We would really have to do an overhaul, a radical overhaul, to even get at your question, because your question in itself is a discursive one, right? So when people talk about, okay, well, how do you think about what's happening today? There is no happening today without the slow violence, Rob Nixon, the slow violence of continued extraction, right? So how I feel about it is how do you feel about being in a spinning ball that you can't control and it's not your fault? You know, you try to hold on to the thing that's next to you, you try to honor the things that came before you, and you do every minute of the day try to decolonize that space, right? So, I mean, we're all doing our bits, right? We're all doing our bits, and as an artist, I'm trying to, figure out this idea of the nomadic so I can understand what it feels like to get off the grid and be agile and build Studio South Zero so I can, who am I to insist that people who want to stay, stay? And then who am I to insist that people who want to be nomadic are nomadic? But do you understand what I'm saying? It's such a complicated, it's a complicated thing to undo, but it's a very clear solution, right? It's a very clear solution, and it has to do with understanding that humanity has a right to not be universal and still be alive and well and thrive.
Mendi or Keith, do you want to take a stab at that question?
I was just thinking about things that Damon said earlier about, being born into a place that is violent, but making it because of the work and the choices of people before you, right? That's part of our inheritance, I don't think I know a time that wasn't violent, but that doesn't mean I remember in 2002 or thereabouts, you introduced me to Leslie Hewitt, and we went to her studio, and she said something like, I don't remember what we were looking at. We were looking at something she made, but she said, I made this because the work we tend to make about people who were enslaved is about pain and violence, but the work that those people made, the art that those people made was not. And I was like, I've been thinking about that for 20 years. It's like, okay, there's a lesson in that. That's right. And so that for me, that's what are the lessons that I have already been exposed to, and trying to extract those, from my own memory and experience,
Well, I want to go back. I want to go back to this question of permanence and impermanence, because that relates to this. Part of our culture is Igbo culture, and in Igbo culture, there's this practice of building imbaris. All right, so when a community has gone through something difficult, an artist is called in to build an imbari. It's a shrine. It's also a museum, and it's both permanent and impermanent, right? So it exists forever in some way because it's dedicated to the earth, but the artist built it with the community. It exists for a short time, and then it decays, and the decay is part of it. And then when you need another one, you commission a new imbari, right? And so that's about remembering the spirits. The artist helps us remember, and then it decays, and you do it again. So that's the work, yeah.
I'm loving everything everybody said. I think the whole thing is about choice. That's what freedom is. I get to choose to stay here, or I get to choose to leave, right? And that's something that is rarely allowed to us. And I think that if, when I hear people talk about like gentrification and stuff like that, and it be the people coming in that's talking about gentrification. You know what I'm saying? It's the people that's coming in, moving the people out, talking about gentrification, and the language changes for every generation. Now it's gentrification. You know what I'm saying? It'll change into something else later. But the thing is to give the people share. As simple as I can put it is leave people alone. You know what I'm saying? Just leave. If you want to move around, you move around. If I want to stay right here, I want to stay right here. But it's people trying to validate the stuff that they finna do to get their own. You know what I'm saying? And then and pontificating on what is horror, and what is wrong. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing that America got to keep doing, generation after generation, and forget what they do and naming it something else. You know what I'm saying? But it's the same thing, and it's like all of this.
Well, you have to keep fortifying white supremacy.
Yeah, something that doesn't make sense, something that doesn't hold up. You know what I'm saying?
Because it's so thin,
Yeah.
right? If you were to take away the conditions of white supremacy and really think about what does it mean to exchange in humanity, in invention, and the possibilities of being, and think about class and real poverty and the body as work, you have to fortify the thing that keeps the violence and the horror in the individual and the fear from the other, that otherwise, right? So then that we who have to think about that otherwise, are in that otherwise in the imagination, understanding the fragility of, in this country, white supremacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's the paradox, the fragility, but the insistent and the ongoingness of the powers that keep it tied so tight.
I think what I'm hearing you say is existing under the conditions of occupation, right? Because that's essentially the conditions we exist within in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. Since we got here. You know what I'm saying?
Since before.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can bring in Cedric Robinson and talk about, racism was not established here, but it was established in Europe in itself. And a sort of a colonial Europe was happening before a global colonial condition happened. So yeah.
Well, we could keep going.
Yeah.
But
Sorry,
I feel like
everybody.
it's an time
Yeah.
to thank you all for your care and generosity.